Welcome to the Clutch Kitten Gaming Podcast, where I play an indie game for 5 hours and let you know whether or not it's worth your time and money.
Hello and welcome everyone, this is James, also known as Clutch Kitten, and I am so happy that you're here for episode 48 of the show. I really hope you enjoyed the conversation I had with Arnaldo in the last episode. It's always such a pleasure talking with a fellow gamer and podcaster, and I really hope you found value, or at least some sort of entertainment value in that discussion. Just a heads up for this episode, I was sick over the past week, so if I start sounding like Louis Armstrong, you'll have to forgive me. I'm mostly feeling better, but my voice isn't cooperating quite as much as I would like it to. Before we run straight into news for this week, I need to mention how you can support the show. Obviously, you've already completed step 1, which is to listen. Listening is by far the best way that you can show me that you like the content I produce, but if you want to go a step further, which we all know that you do, you can do a couple incredibly simple things. First, pull up Apple Podcasts on your computer or phone and give the show a 5-star review. You can also give the show a good review on other outlets like Spotify, but Apple Podcasts is kind of the gold standard in terms of what's used by most people. The second, and arguably the most important thing you can do to support the show apart from listening, is to tell your friends about the podcast. If you're listening to this show, there's a good chance that you're a hardcore gamer, and like myself, you're a beautiful human being with lots of gamer friends. Next time you're playing Dota Underlords with them, maybe mention the podcast instead of talking about how bad the latest season of Game of Thrones was for the 10th time. For all of you overachievers and collectors of podcast mentions, the third and most personal way to show your support of the show is to reach out and say hi. You can find me on Instagram at klutchkittengaming, or you can email me at klutchkittengaming@gmail.com. Say hi, ask me a question, give me feedback, or send me beard care tools. Those two outlets are there for you to hang out with me outside of this weekly 20 minutes. Alright, enough about beards and beautiful people. Let's give a quick Nintendo Switch PSA and then move on to this week's game. If you're a Switch owner, there's a decent chance that at some point you noticed your character moving on screen without you touching the sticks. In that case, one of two things is taking place. Either you have a ghost who loves to game, or you have the fabled Joy-Con drift. I won't get into everything that led up to this because honestly it's unimportant and kind of boring. The important announcement to mention is that you can now get your Joy-Con drift fixed for free. Previously you had to go through some pretty expensive fixes, but Nintendo has decided to right their wrong and fix any drifts for free, in addition to issuing refunds to anyone charged for previous Joy-Con drift repairs. Now that we've gotten our seemingly weekly Nintendo Switch news out of the way, let's get on to the main act of the show. This week we're going to be talking about Owlboy. Owlboy is a 2D platform adventure game developed by D-Pad Studios. It was originally released in November of 2016, but we're taking a look at it because it really found a resurgence when it was released on Switch in February of last year. In regards to D-Pad Studio, the team consists of 5 people, primarily based in Bergen, Norway, but also scattered throughout Texas and Canada. These individuals began working together in 2007, but it wasn't until 2011 that the company was officially founded. Their first released game was called Savant Ascent, and was released in 2013 for PC and mobile. But the crazy thing is that Owlboy was in development pretty much from the beginning, 2007. According to some articles I read, the team felt really weighed down by what the fans expected, which in turn led to this game taking the better part of a decade to be developed and released. That actually brings up a super fascinating topic of discussion, but given that I don't want to delay talking about this game any longer, let's keep moving along. Owlboy currently costs just shy of $25, and according to howlongtobeat.com, it takes anywhere between 8 and 12 hours to beat. In terms of controls, I used my Switch Pro controller, and it worked decently well overall. It did take me a while to get used to the controls, but once I did, it felt fairly smooth. The one ironic thing is that this studio is called D-Pad Studio, but due to this being a game where you fly a lot, I found the D-pad to be the worst way to play. I'm not sure if I'm just weird and it's actually the best way to play, or if it just didn't matter to them in the end. Let's move on now to talk about the narrative. Despite being from a village called Veli on a beautiful island in the sky, it's fair to say that Otus didn't grow up in the best of situations. He was an outcast on almost every front. Not only was he born a mute, unable to take part in the soothing ritual of speech, but he was born into the owl race in a time where far less of his kind roamed the earth. What made things even worse was that he was born clumsy, or so his peers thought. Despite all of these tragic circumstances, Otus did his best to perform his duty for the village, being on watch for the sinister sky pirates. Unfortunately, Otus again failed to live up to his esteemed race and let his town down. Will things ever get better for poor Otus? Owlboy starts out with a pretty sad sequence of events that really give you a picture of what it's like to be Otus. He dreams of being scolded by his mentor, Osseo, and when Otus actually wakes up, he's teased by other owls. Since Otus is unable to reply, to return fire on the bullies, you see his sad eyes sink into depression. Luckily, not all is bad for poor Otus. He does have a human friend named Getty. Getty serves on the Veli Guard and is a mechanic. What's special about Getty is that he's kind and caring to his friend Otus, despite not being able to actually converse. He sees the best in Otus, which makes him the perfect companion as they set out to fight against the invading pirates. Now, before I get into spoiler territory, let's zoom out and look at how the story is presented and what level of quality the narrative is. Although the game is pretty linear in terms of moving from city to city, there is a decent amount of exploration you can do within each area. You can search for hidden treasure, fight roaming enemies, and you can talk with the city folk and read signs. Outside of the primary dialogue and cutscenes, that's where the majority of the world is developed. What I appreciate is that it's really up to you as the player to decide how many of those additional conversations you want to have. Thankfully, even if you just go from story beat to story beat, there still is quite a lot of character building and plot development, and I felt like it was spaced out enough that I didn't get worn out by the constant clicking through of characters talking. When it comes to the quality of storytelling, this is where it's really exciting. I'm still not completely through this game, but unless there's a total 180 in how the story is told, I think my analysis will hold. Overall, I'm very impressed by the story and the world that's built in Owlboy. It could have been very easy for D-Pad Studios to create a standard story about a creature fighting to save its city, and at first glance, Owlboy might look like just that. Isn't it just about Otus trying to save Veli? As I worked my way through this title, I found more and more that this is actually a game about friendship, about being a little bit different, about finding purpose even when people doubt you. D-Pad Studios crafted emotional and impactful themes and packaged them with a pretty standard story arc. What makes it even better is that they wove those themes of friendship and purpose into the actual mechanics of the game as well. We'll get more into those soon, but to wrap up this section, I think Owlboy does something really special. Despite dealing with some not so positive things like depression and bullying, the narrative is generally uplifting throughout the game. Not only was some humor sprinkled in, but the themes of friendship and camaraderie really lent to an all-around feel-good experience. You might be wondering, how in the world do you weave themes of friendship and camaraderie into the mechanics of the game? Well, before we get directly into that, let's set up the basic game design. The first thing you'll probably notice when you load up Owlboy is that it has an unusual amount of verticality. It makes sense in terms of Otus being able to fly, but it was weird at first as the player. Usually when you play a platform adventure game, Iconoclast being another example, you're mostly traversing horizontal arenas, which if you think about it makes a lot more sense in the context of a 2D plane. Despite the odd abstraction of 2D verticality in Owlboy, it actually helped to create a fresh feel. In terms of the basic loop, it's about what you'd expect in this type of game. You speak with a few people, explore an arena, work through some puzzles, fight a boss, gain a new ability, and repeat. The unique part of this loop is how you actually interact with the world. This is where your friends come in. As Otus, you're limited in your ability set. You can fly, dash, spin, and carry objects. Those are your main abilities for a lot of the game, and although those might seem pretty powerful, they aren't offensive abilities at all. You can stun quite a few enemies, but in terms of fighting back, you're pretty useless. The cool thing is that you slowly build a squad of friends as you progress, starting with Getty. You actually end up carrying your friends and being able to use their abilities. Getty has a gun that allows you to fight back, another character has a sort of flamethrower that allows you to access new areas, and another character has a sword which can deflect projectiles. In practicality, adding new characters to your crew is really nothing more than gaining new abilities as the player, but in terms of the narrative, the fact that you're literally carrying your friends and helping each other out with puzzles and fights is so heartwarming. One worry I originally had was that you would have to choose one character to carry at a given time, and although that's true in the sense that you can't use all of their abilities at the same time, you don't have to lock in your choice at a checkpoint or anything like that. Rotating between your friends is as simple as switching between your primary and secondary weapon in Call of Duty. To wrap up our gameplay discussion, let's talk about how the systems actually felt. My biggest complaint with the gameplay is that some of the controls, and also just flying in general, felt loose at times. I got used to it as I played more, but if you're looking for a precise platform adventure, this isn't the one for you. Thankfully, the developers knew that the controls were loose and scaled the enemies and puzzles to match that design. What this created was a pretty easy and smooth experience overall. The puzzles weren't overly challenging or difficult, the bosses didn't usually take more than 1 or 2 tries to beat, and the autosaves were generous, so that when you did die, it didn't feel all that bad. I found that the gameplay was perfect for the systems that this team built. I don't want to give the impression that this game is a walk in the park, but I would also be lying if I said it was extremely challenging. It was easy enough that I could enjoy the good parts of the gameplay and appreciate the overall story and adventure. Now that we've made it through the narrative and gameplay, let's discuss the art and sound design. On the visual side, this game is beautiful. It's in a pixel art style, and I love how well the artists captured emotion even within the constraints of those few pixels. The world they built was colorful and interesting, the art was unique and fun, and honestly, I don't have anything bad to say about the visuals. D-Pad did a stellar job on that front. In terms of the sound design, the soundtrack was also wonderful. It was composed by Jonathan Gear and was made up of a lot of orchestral pieces. In addition to Owlboy, Jonathan has composed music for a few other games, including Neon Chrome and the Franz Kafka game. The main theme of Owlboy is light and airy. It has a sense of mystery and adventure, and the flow of the music fits in nicely with the flying that you're constantly doing. It might be a weird comparison, but some of the music reminded me of the score you hear when you go on the Soarin' Over California ride in California Adventure. That might be too deep of a cut if you haven't been to Disneyland before, but the main point is that the pieces were well composed. Jonathan created beautiful tracks that fit perfectly with the gameplay and emphasized the emotional elements of the narrative. Now that we've made it through the narrative, gameplay, art and sound design, let's summarize with some positives and negatives. First off, on the positive side, the narrative of Owlboy is lovely. I always enjoy when games choose to explore things like friendships and bullying in a more real way, and I think D-Pad Studios did a praiseworthy job of weaving those themes into a fun overarching narrative. Second, the gameplay was fun. The pacing was good, the difficulty was pretty well balanced, and the puzzle design was varied. Third, the art and soundtrack were both top notch. It's clear that a lot of work went into this game on the visual and audio fronts. This is another soundtrack that I'm going to have to add to my ever-growing wishlist of vinyl to pick up. On the negative side, I mainly just have one complaint. It has to do with the feel of controlling Otus. Like I mentioned already, the controls don't feel precise. Flying was sometimes squirrely, picking things up and throwing them wasn't nearly as easy as it should have been, and transitioning between flying and walking was sometimes frustrating. That negative never made me want to quit the game, but it was definitely noticeable. If I was to go from this game to something like Celeste or The Messenger, where everything feels incredibly tight, it would feel pretty bad. To be fair, Owlboy isn't a traditional platformer, so the comparison isn't one-to-one. I still believe my point stands though in the sense that the controls needed to be tightened up. We've made it now to the final boss. This is the part of the podcast where I let you know whether you should slay the game and buy it, flee the game and avoid it, or farm up and wait for a sale. My verdict for Owlboy is to slay this game. The positives far outweigh the negatives, and it's just such a great experience overall. Owlboy scratches a lot of different gaming itches, it's heartwarming, it's not too difficult, and it's a pleasant way to spend a few hours. As always, thank you all so much for taking the time to listen in. Whether this is your first time checking out the show, or you've stuck around for every single episode, I really appreciate your support. Don't forget to give the show a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, and make sure you reach out with your thoughts and questions. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll see you in game.